Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. And this is the story of a war that has broken out in a cathedral town in England in the 19th century, and that war is being led by an odious person named Obadiah Slope. He is the personal chaplain of the new Bishop of Barchester. That bishop is a stranger. They did not promote from within. The church did not promote from within when the old bishop died. So that stranger and his chaplain are causing lots of waves. They are reformists. They want to change the way worship has been done in Barchester for centuries. And that naturally ruffles the feathers of the ecclesiastical establishment in Barchester. Now, there are a whole bunch of other subplots. Obadiah Slope, we're told, is he needs to make his case for the people of Barchester, not just rule with an iron hand through his hand-picked bishop. And we're told that he makes a better impression on women than on men. And one of the women he makes an impression on, of a slight kind, is Eleanor Bold, who is the daughter of a man named Mr. Harding, who was the warden in the previous novel in this series called The Warden. He was the warden of a charitable hospital. He's a kind and gentle man, and was driven out of that position by public controversy raised by Eleanor Bold's late husband. So he's currently living in an apartment over a shop in Barchester, and he's universally revered, and everyone seems to be under the impression that he was done an injustice by that whole outroar, that he should still be warden at the hospital. But in the meantime, the new bishop, Dr. Prouty, and his wife, Mrs. Prouty has thought that it would behoove her, it would be good for her authority in Barchester if she could give that position, be shown to have the power to give that position to someone other than Mr. Harding. So she gives it to a man named Mr. Quiverful, who is a minor canon. He is extremely poor and has a huge family, so the money that comes with that position would very much be appreciated by him. We've seen Mr. Quiverful and his wife in earlier and very effective chapters. But Obadiah Slope thinks that he should arrange through the bishop to get the position back for Mr. Harding, because he has designs to marry Eleanor Bold, who is a rich widow. And he is false to the bone, so he will do whatever he has to do to get that to get that money. But lately, just around chapter 30, Trollope introduced another element here, which is another position, more or less falling open, the deanery at Barchester, a powerful position in the church. The old dean has had a stroke and isn't expected to live. And that naturally raises the question of who will replace him in that role. It's a beautiful house that comes with servants and with an allowance. It has huge grounds, acres and acres of beautiful grounds. It's not a small thing. It's a big, much coveted prize. And it occurs to Mr. Slope that he might like that prize for himself. He might like to be Dean of Barchester, even though he is nobody, even though he's a nobody, comes from nowhere. So that adds to the war in the cathedral close. Will a creature like Mr. Slope be made Dean of Barchester? Mr. Slope has designs on Eleanor's hand for marriage. So does Bertie Stanhope, a useless ne'er-do-well of the Stanhope family who have recently returned to Barchester. And so does Mr. Arabin, another churchman, who the Archdeacon, one of Mr. Slope's enemies, Archdeacon Grantley, has arranged a living, a parish for Mr. Arabin in Barchester, specifically so that he can come there and contest Mr. Slope. Mr. Arabin is a champion contester in newspaper opinion columns, speeches in the open air on the back of a truck or whatnot. We're told that over and over again, although so far in this book we haven't seen it. We're told that Mr. Arabin and Mr. Slope have, in fact, begun to engage in that kind of idea warfare, but we've never seen it. Much less had any idea what effect, if any, it's having on the religious folk in Barchester. But Mr. Arabin also wants the hand of Eleanor Bold in marriage. And unlike Mr. Slope and unlike Bertie Stanhope, he has recently realized that he loves her. He's of course not indifferent to her money, But he's recently realized that he loves her, and he realizes it in the worst way and at the worst time possible. She is staying at Plumstead Episcopi, the country home of Dr. Grantley, and realizes that the whole house thinks that she's going to marry Obadiah Slope, and that infuriates her. All she's been is commonly decent to this guy. She's never shown him any special treatment. She certainly wouldn't conceive of marrying him. They all just appear to think the worst of her and to be willing to do so, and to talk about her behind her back without anyone standing up for her. And she very much includes Mr. Arabin in that. In fact, as Trollope tells us in one of his not infrequent, accurate insights into human nature, she's more angry with Mr. Arabin than she is with any of the others, even though he has spoken the least on the subject, because she wanted him to speak in her defense. She thought better of him. She tells him herself that she expected better handling from him. They have an explosive scene together, and outside, under the elms on the grounds of Dr. Grantley's estate, and then she storms off and heads back to Barchester. And the narrative follows her when she does that. The narrative follows her back to Barchester. That's when she learns, and we learn, that the dean has had his fit, and is now, as one of you so wonderfully put it, Schrodinger's dean. He's neither alive nor dead. He's hovering in superposition. But now the narrative returns to Mr. Arabin, to acquaint us with him. And Trollope wouldn't usually, I don't think, do this, but I think he knows by this point that his readers probably like Mr. Arabin and want to know. We left him wandering around under the elms, morosely moping. He has no idea, no clue. He's never been in love. He has no idea what he's done wrong. He has no idea how to fix it. He has no idea what to say. All he knows is that this is not theoretical anymore. Once upon a time, the thought of Eleanor marrying Mr. Slope bothered him only because it was unworthy. Now he realizes that it bothers him for another reason. It bothers him because he loves her. So let's check in on Mr. Arabin. He's going to go up to Oxford Lazarus College at Oxford, to meet with his old instructor, with the head of that college, Dr. Gwynne, who's been hovering over a lot of chapters by mention in the novel. He never actually becomes a character in the book, but we do get at least to meet him. But anyway, let's see here. Let's get the lighting right in here. I wanted to make sure that you had both Needlepoint Frida and the Elephant of Surprise in the room, and also Elsa. I wanted all of my props, so we're going to use a stage. Every once in a while I film videos in the little book room, and there are lots of things for you to see if you're in here. Lots of tokens of earlier videos. There's the bust of Dante that was given to me by Tom at Tom L.A. Books. There's the Needlepoint Frida. There's Elsa the octopus. There's the Elephant of Surprise. But anyway, this is chapter 34. It's called Oxford, the Master and Tutor of Lazarus. And that's a very boring title, and this is a fairly expository chapter. Trollope's not that bad at those. Not a punishment at all, just thought I'd let you know. There probably won't be much in the way of fiery dialogue. Mr. Arabin, as we have said, had but a sad walk of it under the trees of Plumstead churchyard. He did not appear to any of the family till dinner time, and then he seemed, as far as their judgment went, to be quite himself. He had, as was his wont, asked himself a great many questions, and given himself a great many answers, and the upshot of this was that he had set himself down for an ass. He had determined that he was much too old and much too rusty to commence the maneuvers of love-making, that he had let the time slip through his hands which should have been used for such purposes, and that now he must lie on his bed as he had made it. Then he asked himself whether in truth he did love this woman, and he answered himself, not without a long struggle, but at last honestly, that he did certainly love her. He then asked himself whether he did not also love her money. He again answered himself that he did so, but here he did not answer honestly. It was and ever had been his weakness to look for impure motives for his own conduct. No doubt, circumstanced as he was, with a small living and a fellowship, accustomed as he had been to collegiate luxuries and extensive comforts, he might have hesitated to marry a penniless woman had he felt ever so strong a predilection for the woman herself. No doubt Eleanor's fortune put all such difficulties out of the question, but it was equally without doubt that his love for her had crept upon him without the slightest idea on his part that he could ever benefit from his own condition by sharing her wealth. So we learned two things here. One is that plenty of Trollope's characters pause to ask themselves questions. Very few of them give themselves honest answers. Very few of them give themselves answers that criticize themselves. We know that Mr. Arabin, in his heart, is honest, But we know even more than that, because for all that Trollope's narrator, his famous narrating voice, will often say, oh, I couldn't possibly say, who knows what's in the heart of so-and-so. When he wants to, he can not only get in the heart of a character, but also contradict the heart of a character. Here, the Trollope's narrator is telling us that when Mr. Arabin judges himself, he's judging himself wrong. He's being too hard on himself. We're right there. We don't believe the narrator when he draws the curtain of discretion over things. He can go anywhere he wants. When he had stood on the hearthrug, counting the pattern, that was when Eleanor was yelling at him, and counting also the future chances of his own life, the remembrances of Mrs. Bold's comfortable income had not certainly damped his first assured feeling of love for her. And why should it have done so? Need it have done so with the purest of men? Be that as it may, Mr. Arabin decided against himself. He decided that it had done so in his case, and that he was not the purest of men. He also decided, which was more to his purpose, that Eleanor did not care a straw for him, and that very probably she did care a straw for his rival. Then he made up his mind not to think of her any more, and went on thinking of her till he was almost in a state to drown himself in the little brook which ran at the bottom of the Archdeacon's grounds. And ever and again in his mind would revert to the Signora Neroni. Madeline Neroni is the sister of Bertie Stanhope. She is one of the children of Dr. Vesey Stanhope, who's returned to Barchester. But they're all weird. All the Stanhope children are weird. And Madeline Neroni is called the Signora because she married an Italian who didn't come home with her and appears to be still alive. She's extremely beautiful. She's intensely lame. She can only barely rise from her couch and has to be carried from place to place. And as we've seen in earlier chapters, when she torments Mr. Slope, who's also absolutely infatuated with her, she's cruel and manipulative, like all the Stanhopes are. And now Mr. Arabin is thinking about her. Very strange. Out of left field. Let's see here. And sorry for all the interruptions here. Let's try and read a little of Trollope in between all of my expostulations. And ever and again his mind would revert to Signora Neroni, and he would make comparisons between her and Eleanor Bold, not always in favor of the latter. The Signora had listened to him, and flattered him, and believed in him. At least she had told him so. Mrs. Bold had also listened to him, but had never flattered him, and had not always believed in him, and now had broken from him in violent rage. The Signora, too, was the more lovely woman of the two, and had also the additional attraction of her affliction, for to him it was an attraction. She's entirely false, and penniless. Anyway, but he never could have loved the Signora Neroni as he felt that he now loved Eleanor. Then he flung stones into the brook instead of flinging him in himself, and sat down on its margin as sad a gentleman as you shall meet in a summer's day. He had heard the dinner bell ring as he sat in the churchyard, and he knew that it was time to recover his self-possession. He felt that he was disgracing himself in his own eyes, that he had been idling his time and neglecting the high duties which he had taken upon himself to perform. He should have spent this afternoon among the poor at St. Ewald's, instead of wandering about at Plumstead, an ancient lovelorn swain, dejected and sighing, full of imaginary sorrows and Wertherian grief, the sorrows of young Werther. But I want to mention here, just as an aside, since my expostulations appear to be inevitable, how strange it feels to have the narration even vaguely remember that all these people are churchmen. They should all be attending to the poor of Barchester all the time. None of these churchmen ever even think about their profession. None of them do. Not even the saintly Mr. Harding. None of them do. It's just, I wonder how strange it feels for the narrative to remind us of the absolute truth, which is that Mr. Arabin should be attending to the poor of his diocese. But anyway, he was thoroughly ashamed of himself, and determined to lose no time in retrieving his character, so damaged in his own eyes. Thus, when he appeared at dinner, he was as animated as ever, and was the author of most of the conversation which graced the Archdeacon's board on that evening. Mr. Harding was ill at ease and sick at heart, and did not care to appear more comfortable than he really was. What little he did say was said to his daughter. He thought that his daughter, not Eleanor Bold is his daughter, but so is Dr. Grantley's wife. He has two daughters, so Eleanor Bold is not present, just so you know. He thought that the Archdeacon and Mr. Arabin had leagued together against Eleanor's comfort, and his wish now was to break away from the pair and undergo in his Barchester lodgings whatever fate had in store for him. He hated the name of the hospital. His attempt to regain his lost inheritance there had brought upon him so much suffering. As far as he was concerned, Mr. Quiverful was now welcome to the place. And the Archdeacon was not very lively. The poor Dean's illness was, of course, discussed in the first place. Dr. Grantley did not mention Mr. Slope's name in connection with the expected event of Dr. Trefoil's death, Dr. Trefoil being the Dean, and the Dean still being in quantum superposition. He is still Schrodinger's Dean. He's neither alive nor dead. He did not wish to say anything about Mr. Slope just at present, nor did he wish to make known his sad surmises, but the idea that his enemy might possibly become Dean of Barchester made him very gloomy. Should such an event take place, should such a dire catastrophe come about, there would be an end to his life as far as his life was connected with the city of Barchester. He must give up all his old haunts, all his old habits, and live quietly as retired rector at Plumstead. It had been a severe trial for him to have Dr. Proudie in the palace, but with Mr. Slope also in the deanery, he felt that he should be unable to draw his breath in Barchester close. Thus it came to pass that in spite of the sorrow of his heart, Mr. Arabin was apparently the gayest of the party, and they don't like that. They resent him for it, even though he's hurting worse than any of them. Both Mr. Harding and Dr. Grantley were in a slight degree angry with him on account of his want of gloom. To the one it appeared as though he were triumphing at Eleanor's banishment, and to the other that he was not affected as he should have been by all the sad circumstances of the day, Eleanor's obstinacy, Mr. Slope's success, and the poor Dean's apoplexy. And so they were all at cross purposes. Once that letter from Mr. Slope arrives at Plumstead Episcopi, in an earlier chapter, everything at Plumstead Episcopi is at cross purposes. Everything is. Mr. Harding left the room almost together with the ladies, and then the Archdeacon opened his heart to Mr. Arabin. He still harped upon the hospital. What did that fellow mean, said he, by saying in his letter to Mrs. Bold that if Mr. Harding would call of the bishop, it would be all right? Of course, it would not be guided by anything he might say, but still it may be well that Mr. Harding should see the bishop. It would be foolish to let the thing slip through our fingers because Mrs. Bold is determined to make a fool of herself. They all still believe she's going to marry Obadiah Slope. She absolutely is not, but some ideas. Mr. Arabin hinted that he was not quite so sure that Mrs. Bold would make a fool of herself. She's pretty much admitted that to him. She's made her mind as clear to him as to anybody. Certainly clearer than she's made it to Dr. Grantley. If they'd been if Dr. Grantley and her sister, Mrs. Grantley, had been able to overhear some of the things she said to Mr. Arabin, all of this would be over. He said that he was not convinced that she did not regard Mr. Slope so warmly as she was supposed to do. The Archdeacon questioned and cross-questioned him about this, but elicited nothing, and at last remained firm in his own conviction that he was destined to be the brother-in-law of Mr. Slope. Mr. Arabin strongly advised that Mr. Harding should take no step regarding the hospital in connection with or in consequence of Mr. Slope's letter. If the bishop really means to confer the appointment on Mr. Harding, argued Mr. Arabin, he will take care to let him have some other intimation than the message conveyed through a letter to a lady. Were Mr. Harding to present himself at the palace, he might merely be playing Mr. Slope's game. And thus it was settled that nothing could be done till the great Dr. Gwynne's arrival, or at any rate without the potentate's sanction. It was droll to observe how these men talked of Mr. Harding as though he were a puppet, and planned their intrigues and small ecclesiastical maneuvers in reference to Mr. Harding's future position, without dreaming of taking him into their confidence. There was a comfortable house and income in question, and it was very desirable, and certainly very just, that Mr. Harding should have them. But that, at present, was not the main point. It was expedient to beat the bishop, and if possible, to smash Mr. Slope. Mr. Slope had set up, or was supposed to have set up, a rival candidate. Of all things, the most desirable would have been to have had Mr. Quiverful's appointment published to the public, and then annulled by the clamor of an indignant world, loud in defense of Mr. Harding's right. But of such an event, the chance was small. A slight fraction only of the world would be indignant, and that fraction would be one not accustomed to loud speaking. And then the preferment had in a sort of way been offered to Mr. Harding, and had in a sort of way been refused by him. Notice that even in their scheming, these two relatively good men, Mr. Arabin is a good man, Dr. Grantley is relatively a good man, and we're told, Trollope tells us that it's kind of droll that they're willing to talk about Mr. Harding and his future without ever bothering to include him in their conversations, but overlooks the even greater callousness here, which is that they are saying that the greatest plan here would be to have Mr. Quiverful have his appointment to the hospital be announced publicly and then pulled away from him publicly. And they're thinking that would be a real coup because it would humiliate Mr. Slope without a single thought to what it would do to Quiverful. A totally innocent man. and with a gigantic family. They don't even think about that. Much less they don't think about Mr. Harding. They don't think about Mr. Quiverful, even though he would be the one to pay the most for that kind of a... Anyway, Mr. Slope's wicked, cunning hand had been peculiarly conspicuous in the way in which this had been brought to pass, and it was the success of Mr. Slope's cunning which was so painfully grating to the feelings of the Archbishop. That which of all things he most dreaded was that he should be out-generaled by Mr. Slope, and just at present it appeared probable that Mr. Slope would turn his flank, steal a march on him, cut off his provisions, carry his strong town, and by a coup de main at last beat him thoroughly in a regular pitched battle. The Archdeacon felt that his flank had been turned when desired to wait on Mr. Slope instead of the bishop, that a march had been stolen when Mr. Harding was induced to refuse the bishop's offer, that his provisions would be cut off when Mr. Quiverful got the hospital, and that Eleanor was the strong town doomed to be taken. And that Mr. Slope, as Dean of Barchester, would be regarded by all the world as the conqueror in the final conflict. We now know that's not going to happen. We're pretty sure it's not going to happen. The forces, unbeknownst to Mr. Slope, forces are aligning against him. He has not played his cards well. We have been told from the beginning that he's not going to win Eleanor. Trollope just tells us that right at the beginning. In a wonderful, wonderful Trollopian doublespeak, he says, well, some novelists might keep you in dread about the fate of our heroine, but I'm not one of those. I'll tell you right now, she's never going to be Mrs. Bolt. As if he doesn't do that. And as if he isn't doing that in this book on other subjects. Anyway, Dr. Gwynne was the deus ex machina who was to come down upon the Barchester stage and bring about deliverance from these terrible evils. But how can melodramatic denouements be properly brought about? How can vice and Mr. Slope be punished, and virtue and the Archdeacon be rewarded, while the avenging god is laid up with the gout? Dr. Gwynne has an attack of the gout. In the meantime, evil may be triumphant, and poor innocents, transfixed to the earth by an arrow from Dr. Prouty's quiver, may lie dead upon the ground, not to be resuscitated even by Dr. Gwynne. 2 or 3 days after Eleanor's departure, Mr. Arabin went to Oxford, and soon found himself closeted with the august head of his college. It was quite clear that Dr. Gwynne was not very sanguine as to the effects of his journey to Barchester, and not overly anxious to interfere with the bishop. He had had the gout, but was very nearly convalescent, and Mr. Arabin at once saw that had the mission been one in which the master thoroughly approved, he would before this have been at Plumstead. You have to feel sorry for the poor master of the college. Gout is nothing to laugh about. We do laugh about it. Urosepticemia is extremely painful. Extremely painful. Basically, at a very basic level, it's crystals. It's little crystals of uric acid that have solidified and are moving through blood vessels that are meant to carry liquid, not solid. It's excruciatingly painful. And it comes in waves. Usually it comes in waves. But when you hear an old-timey story of Ben Franklin or this character having the gout or whatnot, it's not always good to laugh at it. It was unbelievably painful, in addition to dangerous, but it was also something to be pitied. Like stones, like having kidney stones or gallbladder stones or gallstones or whatnot. That also is often mentioned in these old accounts. There's anything that medical science could do about it. Every once in a while you get a figure like Samuel Pepys, who was cut for the stone successfully, had a stone taken out of him. Most people either died of those operations because there was no sterilizing the instruments. There was no proof against infection and death. But also most people never had those things, so they just lived with that pain over and over again. But anyway, these interruptions, I swear. As it was, Dr. Gwynne was resolved on visiting his friend, and willingly promised to return to Barchester with Mr. Arabin. He could not bring himself to believe that there was any probability that Mr. Slope would be made Dean of Barchester. Rumour, he said, had reached even his ears, not at all favourable to that gentleman's character, and he expressed himself strongly of opinion that any such appointment was quite out of the question. At this stage of the proceedings, the master's right-hand man, Tom Staple, was called in to assist at the conference. Tom Staple was the tutor of Lazarus, and moreover a great man at Oxford. Though universally known by a species of nomenclature so very undignified, Tom Staple was one who maintained a high dignity at the university. He was, as it were, the leader of the Oxford tutors, a body of men who consider themselves collectively as being very little, if at all, second in importance to the heads themselves. It is not always the case that the master, or warden, or provost, or principal can hit it off exactly with his tutor. A tutor is by no means indisposed to have a will of his own, But at Lazarus they were great friends and firm allies at the time of which we are writing. A little bit of insider baseball there about university politics. You're going to get a little bit more of it, but you're not going to have to worry much about Mr. Staple, so don't. Tom Staple was a hale, strong man of about 45, short in stature, swarthy in face, with strong, sturdy black hair and crisp black beard, of which very little was allowed to show itself in the shape of whiskers. He doesn't have whiskers, and Trollope did. He's swarthy, and Trollope wasn't. So we know what's coming. We know that he's going to be character assassinated. He always wore a white neckcloth, clean indeed, but not tied with that scrupulous care which now distinguishes some of our younger clergy. He was, of course, always clothed in a seemly suit of solemn black. Mr. Staple was a decent, cleanly liver, not overly addicted to any sensuality, but nevertheless a somewhat warmish hue was beginning to adorn his nose. The peculiar effect, as his friends averred, of a certain pipe of port, introduced into the cellars of Lazarus the very same year in which the tutor entered it as a freshman. There was also, perhaps, a little redolence of port wine, as it were, the slightest possible twang in Mr. Staple's voice. I swear, Tony's the biggest gossip in the village. In these latter days, Tom Staple was not a happy man. University reform had long been his bugbear, and now was his bane. It was not with him, as with most others, an affair of politics, respecting which, when the need existed, he could, for party's sake or on behalf of principle, maintain a certain amount of necessary zeal. It was not with him a subject for dilettante warfare and courteous commonplace opposition. To him it was life and death. The status quo of the university was his only idea of life, and any reformation was as bad to him as death. He would willingly have been a martyr in the case, had the cause admitted of martyrdom. It goes on. Trollope goes on about how Tom Staple doesn't like reforms at university. It has nothing to do with this book. It's just Trollope commenting on university politics. So I wonder if you might indulge me and let us just skip a few paragraphs. You can go and read them on your own. They have no effect on anything, and they are a little boring. Let's just skip to the conversation. It's just 3 paragraphs that we're skipping. I won't make a habit of it. But it's all insider baseball. It's just Trollope writing about reforms at Oxford. Anyway, let's let Tom Staple join the conversation. You can go back and read those things on your own, and a competent editor would have cut them. And now Tom Staple proffered such wisdom as he had for the assistance of Dr. Gwynne and Mr. Arabin. Quite out of the question, said he, arguing that Mr. Slope could not possibly be made the new dean of Barchester. So I think, said his master. He has no standing. If all I hear be true, very little character. As to character, said Tom Staple, I don't think much of that. They rather like loose parsons for deans. A little fast living or a dash of infidelity is no bad recommendation to a cathedral close. But they couldn't make Mr. Slope. The last 2 deans have been Cambridge men. You'll not show me an instance of their making 3 men running from that same university. We don't get our share, and never shall, I suppose, but we must at least have 1 out of 3. Those sorts of rules are all gone by now, said Mr. Arabin. Everything has gone by, I believe, said Tom Staple. The cigar has been smoked out, and we are the ashes. Speak for yourself, Staple, said the master. I speak for all, said the tutor, stoutly. It's coming to that there will be no life left anywhere in the country. No one is any longer fit to rule himself or those belonging to him. The government is to find us all in everything, and the press is to find the government. Nevertheless, Mr. Slope won't be dean of Barchester. Okay, so Tom Staple is a QAnon believer. And who will be warden of the hospital, said Mr. Arabin. I hear that Mr. Quiverful is already appointed, said Tom Staple. I think not, said the master, and I think, moreover, that Dr. Prouty will not be so short-sighted as to run against such a rock. Mr. Slope should himself have sense enough to prevent it. But perhaps Mr. Slope may have no objection to see his patron on a rock, said the suspicious tutor. What could he get by that? Asked Mr. Arabin. In other words, why would Mr. Slope put forward Mr. Quiverful when he knows how popular Mr. Harding is? Why would he bring that much trouble on his bishop? It is impossible to see the doubles of such a man, said Mr. Staple. It seems quite clear that Bishop Prouty is altogether in his hands, and it is equally clear that he has been moving heaven and earth to get this Quiverful into the hospital, although he must know that such an appointment would be most damaging to the bishop. It is impossible to understand such a man, and dreadful to think, added Tom Staple, sighing deeply, that the welfare and fortunes of good men may depend on his intrigues. Dr. Gwynne or Mr. Staple were not in the least aware, nor even was Mr. Arabin, that this Mr. Slope, of whom they were talking, had been using his utmost efforts to put their own candidate into the hospital, and that in lieu of being permanent in the palace, his own expulsion therefrom had been already decided on by the high powers of the diocese, meaning Mrs. Prouty has no power in the diocese at all. I'll tell you what, said the tutor, if this Quiverful is thrust into the hospital and Dr. Trefoil does die, I should not wonder if the government were to make Mr. Harding Dean of Barchester. They would feel bound to do something for him after all that was said when he resigned. Dr. Gwynne at that moment made no reply to this suggestion, but it did not the less impress itself on his mind. If Mr. Harding could not be warden of the hospital, why should he not be Dean of Barchester? And so the conference ended without any very fixed resolution, and Dr. Gwynne and Mr. Arabin prepared for their journey to Plumstead on the morrow. So that is chapter 34 of Barchester Towers. It's a small thing. It could easily have been folded into the rest of the book. We didn't need to see it. We could have been informed elsewhere, probably to better effect, that Mr. Arabin is heartsick over his rupture with Eleanor. And then there's that bombshell at the very end, which also could have been found elsewhere, or might have been a rare lapse for Trollope, might have been more effective as a bombshell later in the book, as an actual surprise sprung upon the reader. Here it's being discussed that Mr. Harding, saintly Mr. Harding, might be the new Dean of Barchester. All of a sudden the reader's thinking, God, of course. That way Quiverful does get the money he desperately needs for his family, but Mr. Harding does get his comfortable living and the honors of public life back. Everybody's happy. And it gets rid of Mr. Slope. All of a sudden, this possibility is introduced out of nowhere. By nobody. By Tom Staple, who's fond of port wine. So that is this chapter. It wasn't much. It's a little thing running through my read-throughs today is that the chapters aren't much. But bigger things are coming, of course, because the head of Lazarus College and Mr. Arabin are not going to Plumstead Episcopi merely to have a chat with Dr. Grantley. They're going for this big to-do, this big lawn party at Ullathorne Court, where everybody is going. The Vesey Stanhopes are going. Mr. Slope is going. The Archdeacon is going. Eleanor Bold is going. Everyone is going to this big party. Those are always fun. Trollope never does those wrong. So I think we get to that in the next chapter. We shall see. I'll wrap this up for now. Sorry for all the intrusions into the narrative. I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.